Welcome, everybody, to the Circle of Insight, the Dr. Carlos Show. Today we're going to be looking at Madrassas and Militant Islam with Dr. Christine Fair. Dr. Fair is the Associate Professor at Georgetown University's Solely Secret Studies program at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Services. And she's going to bring some insight to us today about madrasas and how they relate to the world of militant Islam. Well, let's not waste any more time. Let's get started. Welcome, Dr. Fair, to the show. Welcome, Doctor.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for being here. A really fascinating topic, but before we get into the weeds, for some of those who don't know, what is a madrasa?
Yeah, so madrasa literally means school. So if you are in a Muslim country and you use the word madrasa to reference what we mean, which is a religious seminary, they might look at you with some puzzlement. So, for example, in Pakistan, typically they'll use the expression Dini madrasa to make it clear that they're talking about a religious school as opposed to just any other kind of school. And then within the madrasa system, the madrasa itself typically refers to a school where there is a full curriculum of religious studies. But not everything that is called a madrasa is in fact that. So you'll also have what's called a maktab, which is, for lack of a better word, like a primary school. And that's where very basic religious education will take place. Like, for example, learning to read and recite the Quran, as well as memorization of a Quran. So it's much more complicated than it's sometimes made out to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said Dini madrasas. What does Dini refer to?
So Dini means religious.
Religious, okay.
Yeah.
All right, just in case. So Dini, religious madrasa schools. Now, so you said it was a seminary. What's the usual age that goes in?
All right, so this is where what is supposed to happen versus what actually happens.
One of those, all right.
One of those. Yeah, so years ago when I was working on my book on madrasas in Pakistan, there was a lot of discussion about madrasa reform and expanding the curriculum. And what the heads of the various madrasas pointed out that this wasn't necessary because a madrasa is supposed to be a school for specialization, meaning that they claimed that they didn't take anyone that didn't have an 8th or a 10th grade education. And so the argument that they made was that in the Pakistan system, this is when, if you were going to be a doctor, for example, you would start specializing. So in theory, they said that you had to come in with this basic educational background. But when I actually went and did field work inside the madrasas, you actually saw that didn't happen all the time, or in fact often. So this idea that this was a place for specialization only, and that you would only come into the madrasa system after having done basic education in the Pakistani, mainstream schools, just simply wasn't true.
Now, I hate to have you make assumptions, but why do you think this is?
Well, I mean, madrasas are, basically, it's business, right? Business. Madrasas are big business. And so I think that's part of it. They're not going to turn someone away. So when I talk about madrasas being big business, I mean that quite literally. So if you will go to one of the campuses where these madrasas are housed, you'll see a lot of private sector activity. So you'll find marriage halls. Marriages are big business in places like Pakistan. You'll find restaurants, any kind of printing presses, any sort of commercial activity will be on properties that are owned by the madrasa administrators. And they'll use those private sector activities to cross-subsidize some of the things that they'll do charitably. So, for example, free tuition for children that are poor. Many of the wealthy businessmen in Pakistan, because they don't pay income tax, they'll pay the Islamic charity zakat directly to the madrasa, either writing a check, or they will make large donations of in-kind goods. Like there's always at a madrasa a large kitchen, and so they'll donate things for the kitchen, like dal, rice, even meat. Actually, they'll donate animals to be killed.
Oh, wow.
And served at the madrasa. Yeah, so a lot of madrasas are very large, well-established institutions that are microeconomies that are thriving.
Fascinating. How many people are involved in all this? Are we talking like hundreds of people in this little?
Easily.
Wow.
So the larger established madrasas, they live on these enormous properties, and they're just huge. Now, not all madrasas fit that description, but this idea that madrasas are these charitable enterprises, it just isn't true. I mean, this is like any school. They don't do this if there's not profits to be had. I mean, I was actually quite surprised at how well remunerated the madrasa officials were. I mean, you can see it in the kinds of cars that they were driving.
Oh, really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, all right, and no comment on that. Let me ask you if there's any differences in the madrasas between the ones in Pakistan and other countries. Are there any distinctions?
Well, that's a question I can't answer because I'm a South Asianist, and so
Okay.
what I can say is that there is a lot of variation amongst madrasas in Pakistan itself. There are 5 school boards, if you will, and they differ principally. So there are 4 Sunni school boards, and there's 1 Shia school board. Amongst the 4 Sunni schools, some have been wiser than others in terms of the quality of the education that goes forward. Like the Jamaat Islami schools,
Oh, interesting.
honestly, if I were a Pakistani, I'd rather put my kid in a Jamaat Islami madrasa than a Pakistani regular school, because they had been thinking through curriculum reform decades ago. Then you have, now this is the complicated question that everyone asks, is what is the ties between madrasas and militants? Well, it depends on the terrorist group in question. So the principal terrorist groups that are blowing up Pakistanis and blowing up Americans and our allies in Afghanistan, they are affiliates of one school of Islam that's called Deobandi. And the Deobandi militants do have strong ties to archipelago of Deobandi madrasas. But not all terrorist organizations rely upon the madrasa infrastructure. So, for example, Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is, I think, the most ferocious South Asian terrorist group, they were the ones behind holding Mumbai, the siege in Mumbai in 2008. They don't rely upon madrasas at all.
Oh.
And the reason for that is they need well-educated recruits for the kinds of operations that they do. And you don't get those typically at a madrasa.
Fascinating. So they sound like a smaller outfit as well, then.
Well, they're a pretty big outfit, but I tend to think of them as special operators. Now,
Okay.
even among the Deobandi groups, some recruits will come from madrasas and some recruits won't. But when we talk about that madrasa militancy connection, we're really talking about a specific set of militant groups. The Taliban itself, Talib means student, so Taliban is the plural of students. And they are so called because they actually came out of, again, a network of madrasas in Pakistan, and they gave themselves the name Taliban to emphasize that they were a movement principally of seminary students.
You've wiped out about half my questions. You're great. Very prescient, Dr. Fair. You're wiping everything out here. Let me ask you this question, just to make sure that we're fair to everybody. Not all madrasas are connected to militant Islam, correct?
Oh, I would say most of them aren't.
Okay.
And to be the other issue that I think it's grossly exaggerated, again, I can only speak to Pakistan,
Sure.
and to some extent Bangladesh. I study the same thing in Bangladesh. The madrasa structure in Bangladesh is mind-bogglingly different.
Oh, wow.
But the other thing is that there are a couple of misconceptions. One is that somehow madrasa market share has exploded. Now, what people will typically do is that they'll typically look at the number of madrasas and they'll say, see, this is a problem. Well, that's a really silly metric because Pakistan's school-age population continues to increase. So we would expect the inventory of madrasas to expand as Pakistan's population is expanded. But so you have to look at that in the context of other kinds of schools. So when we use survey data that asks families for an educational inventory of everyone in the household, this is what we learn. So if we think of market share we think of market share in the following way. Let's look at madrasa, public, and private schools. Those are the three primary educational markets. The denominator is going to be all school-age children, right? And so the private school market share will be all students in private school divided by all children in school. And we do that similarly for madrasas as well as for private schools. What we actually learn is that the majority of Pakistan's children are going to public school. So we're looking at 70%.
Oh, wow.
But it has been losing market share steadily over the last 15, we've had these data since 1991. It's been losing market share to private schools. Madrasa market share has been stable at well below 1%. It is essentially a rounding error between public and private schools. So very few students are going to these madrasas full time. Instead, most people that use a madrasa will use it like people here use Hebrew school or Sunday school. They'll go for a very short amount of time, typically to learn how to recite the Quran or to learn to memorize it, which is a much bigger time investment. So they will use it as a complement to a regular school. The other thing that we learn from these survey data is that the story that madrasas are the school of the last resort for the poor is also nonsense. And the reason is the first decision that a family makes is going to be whether or not to educate a student. Now, in a country like the United States where education is compulsory, that is not an option. But remember, Pakistan still has a very important place for child labor. So a family that's really poor is going to have to trade off the opportunity cost of sending this kid to a madrasa, which is going to have very little reward for the family in terms of economic opportunities for that child, versus having the kid work in the field. Most businesses in Pakistan are truly small, not like what we have, not what we call small businesses here. They'll be like running a small shop, bicycle repair, motorcycle repair, tire repair. So the first thing that a family is going to decide is it worth taking the kid out of earnings to put them in a madrasa? And a lot of families think that that's a bad choice, and so they won't do it. So when we actually look at the income distribution of students in madrasas and public schools, we find that they're very similar, except we find more wealthy students in madrasas than we see in public schools.
Fascinating conversation. Let me ask you this then, to try to eliminate another misnomer if it is. What do you think, if you can approximate or guess, the percentage of militants that may come out of a madrasa? Is it pretty small then?
Well, so again, you have to look at the specific militant groups. So Lashkar-e-Taiba doesn't recruit from militants, from madrasas. What it typically does, a group like Lashkar-e-Taiba, is that once they've recruited someone, they are of the belief that their jihadis should also be indoctrinated into the particular belief of their LA Hadith. That's the school to which they belong.
Okay.
So what will typically happen is after people have already joined the organization, they will then begin attending Lashkar-e-Taiba's own indoctrination, because they are a very special school of thought in Pakistan. There's not a lot of people that follow this tradition. So for them, they're not only using recruitment to create terrorists, they're also using it to proselytize this particular belief. When we're looking at the Pakistani Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, and the groups that are killing Shia, those are the groups that primarily rely upon madrasas. And I couldn't even offer you an estimate. And the reason is no one keeps data on this. And I'm of the belief that giving someone a bad number is actually worse than no number at all, because a bad number will misinform policymakers. So people like me that study this, we have been making appeals that the backgrounds of these terrorists become known. But the problem is that they get killed, right? The only reason we know about them is that they've either been killed or they've been captured. So we have enormous selection effects in the data. So this means that we don't have, there's no database about everyone that wants to be a terrorist or currently is a terrorist. We only know about them once they attempt to undertake an attack and they're either killed or captured. So
Gotcha.
It's hard. But I'm not going to offer a number, because that number will certainly be wrong and will be misleading. But for these groups, madrasas are very important. Even if the individual wasn't recruited from a madrasa, having the recommendation of someone at a madrasa for these Deobandi groups is really important, because one of the things that you have in the terrorist business is that you don't always know if you can trust the recruit, right? Maybe they're coming from Pakistani intelligence, maybe they're a CIA mole, maybe they work for Afghan intelligence. So having some connection to this madrasa network is one of the ways that they can vouch for the person's bona fides, and it serves as a surveillance system so that they can have less suspicion that the person might be working for some intelligence organization. This is a problem of personnel management that terrorists have, right? When a person presents, hey, I want to be a terrorist, well, how do you know he's not a mole? And it's usually a he. So those networks, for example, madrasas are one way of dealing with this, what we'd call it an asymmetric information problem. Lashkar, the group that doesn't use madrasas, has a different structure, and that is they have a network of observers at very local levels, and they have minders. They literally keep an eye on the people that have joined, and this is to make sure that they're not spies. This is to make sure that they're not retrenching from the commitment that they made to the organization. So, all terrorist organizations have this commitment problem. And madrasas are one way of resolving that commitment problem.
Yeah, fascinating. Let me ask you this. We got a couple minutes left, and I want to throw this in here. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, this is Dr. Christine Fair, Associate Professor at Georgetown University, and author of a really wonderful book, Fighting to the End, the Pakistan Army Way of War. Really interesting read. Highly recommend it. Dr. Fair, what do we know about Saudi Arabia funding connections? Do they have any in regards to Pakistan?
Yeah, so this is another, I think, misnomer. So what will typically happen is that the biggest hindrance to building a madrasa is the actual physical startup costs of getting the land and buying it. And actually, a lot of madrasas are simply built on squatter land. So this literally happens. Huh. Someone will put down a prayer mat on public land. Then they'll put down some concrete. And then oh no, I'm not kidding you at all. And then this happens. It also happens in India, by the way. If you spend time in India, it'll first start. Someone will tie an amulet to a tree. Then they'll put an idol in the tree. Then you'll come back and there'll be some tiles laid around the tree. And the next thing you know, this encroachment becomes essentially a temple or a mosque or what have you, or a shrine. And once it's built, it is incredibly difficult to unbuild them because it's so unpopular to tear down a house of worship. So the same thing happens in Pakistan. So if you want to do this officially, as opposed to just, stealing public land, it's remarkable to watch it happen.
So.
You have to buy land. You have to get a lot of state permissions. And to go that route, you almost always need a lot of startup capital. And this is where the Saudis are very effective, because they will provide you that startup capital to build a mosque from scratch legitimately. Now, or a madrasa. But what people then tend to make the mistake of thinking is that the recurring costs of these madrasas, or for that matter mosques, are also paid for by the Saudis. And what I observed is that once these things are built, they are self-subsidizing, both through the private sector activities that I told you about, but also because very wealthy Pakistanis, they do not pay income tax. We are paying their income tax. The American taxpayer is paying their taxes for them.
Dr. Fair, you just gave me a headache, Dr. Fair, but go ahead.
I'm sorry. I know, I have that effect on people. No, so the wealthy, they don't have an income tax, and, they have an income tax, but there's no compliance. So what instead wealthy people do is that they pay their zakat, their charitable taxes, to the madrasas in their locality. So once the madrasas are built, they're very easily self-sustained by local resources. And so I tell people, don't think it's a panacea to tell the Saudis, even if we could, basically with a magical wand, have the Saudis, and also I might add the Qataris, stop funding these institutions. It won't go away, because these are, in my belief, largely, once these things are built, they're largely sustained by local actors and through this cross-subsidy that we see happening in the larger madrasas that also run private sector enterprises. Now, here's one of the most interesting developments in the educational market that people don't typically remark upon, is that madrasas know that families in Pakistan want their kids to have what they'll call, they don't use the word secular, because secular means something very different in Pakistan, a worldly education. But they want it in an Islamic environment. So some of the bigger madrasa chains are building private schools. And they're teaching the private school curriculum, but their value added is that it's happening in an Islamic environment. Other madrasas are combining the madrasa curriculum with the public school curriculum, so that when students graduate, they will be both an alim, which is someone who's completed the madrasa curriculum, as well as ready to go to college. And people are paying a lot of money so that their kids can go to these new private sector madrasa enterprises. And this is actually a very fast-growing business. Now, believe it or not, some of the militant groups are in this business. Lashkar-e-Taiba has a chain of schools called the Taqwa chain of schools, and they are charging fees that rival some of Pakistan's most elite institutions.
Really? So
they're
actually making money to educate. Fascinating.
Well, here, you want to have another headache? So with our new Secretary of Education, Ms. DeVos, all of the talk is about charter schools, right? And
yeah.
Well, back when I was living in California, there was a terrorist organization called Al-Fuqra, and they took, and it gets, just hang on to your head because it's going to burst. California had vouchers. This terrorist organization was running a madrasa, and they were getting paid for it by vouchers. So, this is going to happen as vouchers become more available. There will be madrasas in the United States benefiting from the voucher system as they have in the past, but no one paid attention to them.
Yeah, I get the funny feeling. Hopefully, they will now.
I don't know. We'll find out.
Oh, jeez. Well,
but yeah, the Al-Fuqra organization, that was they also had a welfare scam that they were running. They had these trailer parks.
That's how I knew about them. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got trailer park roots in Indiana. So the people that lived in them would hand over their government checks, and that was one of the ways in which they were subsidizing themselves. So they had Al-Fuqra compounds in both Virginia and California.
Oh, jeez.
In the name. I mean, come on, Al-Fuqra? Really? It's not even a joke. I wish I had written that as a joke, but no, it's the truth.
No comment.
Exactly.
Dr. Fair, well, we're running out of time, unfortunately. I'll have to ask you another time.
Right.
I was going to ask you a little bit about the curriculum, but everybody, this is Dr. Christine Fair. Her book, Fighting to the End, The Pakistan Army Way of War. We're going to have to bring her back so she can tell us more about this book. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. We had some great insight at the end. Fascinating stuff. Fighting to the End of War. Dr. Fair, where can we get more information about you and what you're up to?
Oh, my website. I put everything out there, including I've written several articles on the economy of madrasas and also the curriculum. One quick thing, that curriculum is not, that curriculum is hard. People say they don't do math. Well, believe it or not, in the madrasa curriculum, they're doing Ptolemy, right? The Greek,
wow.
yes, the Greek geometrist, but they're reading Ptolemy translated into Arabic. Right, so there's a lot of misconceptions about the rigor of that curriculum. Can you imagine? We didn't read Ptolemy.
Oh yeah, I was looking more into. I can barely spell the name. I was looking more into whether it's Wahhabi or Salafi or anything like that. I wasn't sure.
Well, the basic curriculum is actually quite similar. What they do to distinguish the different sects is they read specific hadiths. And so there is this function like what you'll have with Catholics and Protestants, because ultimately they're turning out religious instructors that will argue the supremacy of one school over the other. So there are certainly additional texts that they will use to make that argumentation. But the core is actually a fixed curriculum called the Darse Nizami, which literally means the organization of study. And it's been fairly fixed for well over 100 years, but that's the kind of stuff that they're reading. They're reading Persian, they're reading Arabic, and the stuff they're reading is not simple.
Wow, amazing. Fascinating conversation. We have to bring it back, Dr. Fair. We definitely have to bring it back. We don't have enough time.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great fun.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I hope you enjoy the show as much as I do. I know you want her back. We'll bring her back as soon as we can. Remember to catch us on behavioranalysisgroup.com to find out more about some other shows we've done, and we'll catch you all next time.